But if for some reason you did have to hop up and straddle that front top tube, it's gonna be pretty close, if not touching your private zone. Let me say it better. Hey everyone, I'm Mike Kasmer. We're here in Pemberton, British Columbia for the Pinkbike Field Test. Today we're going to be taking a look at the GT Force 29. GT Force first came out last year in the 27.5 inch version. You saw that on the Enduro World Series race circuit. But this one, aluminum frame, new for this year, and it comes with 29 inch wheels. According to GT, this bike was designed for riders who prefer descending and like to go fast. They say it hits the sweet spot between all mountain and downhill, which to me sounds like an Enduro bike. At the moment, the bike's only available with an aluminum frame and at 3 price points. So what components do you get on a bike that has the word Pro in its name? In this case, you have Fox's 36 Performance Elite fork, so that has the Grip 2 damper. So basically the same as the highest end one, just with a different coating on the stanchions. Rear shock is a Fox Float X2 Performance, so you don't have quite as many adjustments as the highest end version, but it is still quite adjustable. You got a set of Stan's Flow MK3 wheels, and then as far as drivetrain goes, there's a SRAM GX drivetrain, 12 speed, and brakes are SRAM's new G2 brakes. Just like its 27.5 inch wheeled sibling, the new Force 29 uses the LTS suspension design. That's basically GT's take on a horse link. According to GT, this bike is slightly more progressive than 27.5 inch version, and they also say they can work well with a coil shock or an air shock. Although all the complete models, they're coming with air shock only. As far as other frame details for the Force 29 go, we've got a threaded bottom bracket, IC-G05 tabs, and external cable routing versus the internal cable routing that's kind of become the norm over the last few years. And there's also room for a water bottle, which is always nice to see. And there's a little bit of chainstay protection. They didn't really go overboard there, but should get the job done. As far as setup goes, this bike was equipped with our control tires, in this case the Maxxis Assegai, double down casing, 2.5 inch wide. I ran 20 pounds up front, 22 in the rear, and for the rear shock I had 195 pounds, put me right about 25% sag, and then in the fork I had 72 PSI, and that float 36.
So I put 22 and 23 PSI in the front and rear tires respectively. I also had the shock at 216 PSI. GT recommends around 25% sag to start off with, and then finally I had 88 PSI in the fork.
The climbing position on the GT felt comfortable for me. It's got that 76.6 degree seat tube angle, so nice and steep. And compared to the Specialized, the bike as a whole, the wheelbase a little bit shorter, a little bit easier to get around some of those tighter switchbacks. It is worth mentioning the weight. At 35.6 pounds, this was the heaviest bike in the category. Granted, it does have an aluminum frame while the other contenders had carbon frames, but no matter how you slice it, you're gonna notice that if you're out for a big long pedal. And as far as suspension performance goes, it does have a little extra movement, that horse link design, even at 25% sag, still kind of sinks into its travel a little bit. There is that climb switch, pretty easy to reach, but just something to keep in mind.
I felt like it was maybe a touch slow off the line, but once you got it up to speed, it definitely handled fairly confidently. I did enjoy riding this bike through high-speed chunder. Highlight for me was cornering. It railed corners. Like I mentioned before, I ran the shock at about 25% sag, and even with that lesser sag than other bikes, you know, I still hit the bottom pretty often. If you're a heavier, thicker boy like me, I'd suggest probably putting another volume spacer in that shock, although you'd be at the maximum number of volume spacers at that point.
Yeah, and even for me, like we've said, I'm a little bit lighter, but I still felt that it kind of used this travel a little bit more quickly than I would have liked. I would also put an extra volume spacer in here. Just kind of felt like it rode a little deeper than you want for this type of bike, and with that reduced amount of sag that they recommend. Overall, the bike has really good traction, even in some of the wetter conditions we were in, no problems there.
So for the time testing, the GT, surprisingly for me, was only 1% slower than my fastest bike. I'm not sure if that's due to the G2 brakes just not slowing me down, or if the bike was actually just that fast, but it felt good on the test lap for sure.
And for me, it was actually my second fastest lap time, but it was only 1% slower, so pretty impressive again for a bike that cost half the price. I was able to go pretty much the same speed.
The front fork was really good from Fox. The Grip 2 damper worked as expected. The shock was also a pretty good performer, although I think a lot of heavier and hard charging riders would probably throw another volume spacer in there.
One of the reasons we chose to include the GT in this year's field test was so that we could see how it compares against some of these crazy expensive super bikes that we also have on hand. The parts on it, they look like they'd be a solid spec for the price. Turns out that's not quite the case. We were disappointed with several of the components that GT chose. The first, and probably the most important part, is the brakes. They chose to spec the G2 brakes. It's a new brake from SRAM, kind of aimed at that trail market, and we've had good luck with it on the lighter duty bikes. With this one, when you get on steep terrain and you grab on, there's just not the power, especially on longer sustained descents. Then there's also the wheels. It has Stan's Flow MK3 wheel set, and after only 2 days in the bike park, they pretty much nearly were fully detensioned. Tensioned them up again, and then a couple more days riding, they were back to having almost zero spoke tension.
So with the GT, I was actually pretty comfortable right away when I got on it. I was, my first lap was on Dirt Merchant, hit all the jumps on there, no problem. That's pretty good about a bike to just get on there and charge right away. The suspension on the bike, like we said before, pretty dialed. That rear shock could use some tweaking, but overall, I think most riders will be happy with it. The frame is definitely capable, and I think the components are probably the thing that mostly holds it back, but the Giro seems pretty sorted.
So like we mentioned before, this bike is on the heavier side, even for an aluminum frame. Just got a few extra pounds there. If you're purely focused on descending, not as big a deal, but if you're gonna be planning on pedaling, you might wanna consider that. There's also the fact that this frame has a fairly tall standover height. You don't really notice that as much when you're on the trail, but if for some reason you did have to hop up and straddle that front top tube, it's gonna be pretty close, if not touching your private zone. Let me say it better. As we mentioned before, some of those components, they just aren't up to the hard charging that this bike is designed for. The G2 brakes, as well as the Stan's wheels, they just didn't hold up. And it's not that those are bad parts. They didn't go super budget and spec the cheapest things they could find. They just picked the wrong ones. A set of code brakes on this, maybe a set of Stan's S1 wheels or the new Flow EX3. Those would likely have been a better choice and probably been just fine. We're big fans of value-priced aluminum bikes, especially if the geometry's sorted. I mean, there's a lot to be said for a bike you don't have to worry about having super fancy, lightweight, delicate parts on. You can just hammer all day, every day. It's potentially, you might be able to look at actually the cheaper version of this, get the same frame, maybe upgrade some of those key components and get a little more bang for your buck.
So that's the GT Force 29 in a nutshell. Stay tuned for more from the Pinkbike Field Test, as well as a roundtable discussion where we compare and contrast all these enduro bikes.